please do ask questions. We prepared a few that I'll let the panelists know about, but I think we'd all love to take some live questions from the field. So while they're speaking, I'll monitor the chat and the Q&A feature. Hey everyone, great to see you all again. Yeah, welcome. Okay, so I prepared a few questions, and as we discussed, I'll call on a few people to start, and if you want to jump in after those folks are done, I'll leave it open and kind of give some space for anyone to chat. And when that space feels like it goes on too long, I'll try to list to the next one. So one question I wanted to ask, because this I hear all the time, and a common sort of excuse or thing I hear from customers is that leaders are too busy for big development programs. And I'm curious if you've heard that, how you work with that.
Sure, yeah. So my thoughts around this always come back to the sort of tried and true teachings from Stephen Covey's 7 Habits of Highly Effective People. One aspect of that being sort of prioritizing the right things and understanding that working on things that are important and not urgent really have a positive effect downstream. And then the other habit that he talks about is sharpening the saw, and how much more effective you can be, with the analogy of trying to cut wood with a dull saw versus taking the time to stop, pause, sharpen the tool that you're using. It just helps you to become more effective downstream. So it's just so important to prioritize that time that you need to take to just examine the tools you're using and learn more tools that can help you be effective.
All right, I'll see. Can you hear me now? Yay, okay, wonderful. Just to kind of build on that, I completely agree with you, Carla, and making that time. But one thing that I've seen is with really high performance individuals is giving the permission, and as senior leaders, really modeling the behavior where, as senior leaders, we talk about, hey, here's my area of opportunity that I'm working on developing. Here's why, here's what I'm doing to do it. And just being open in that conversation and saying, how can I help you? What are you doing? But then from, all the best practices in change management, you need that reinforcement loop. And so one thing that we have found to be successful at Prodigy, like our mission is all about learning. We're an educational technology company. So to not have that lived in our company would be so disingenuous and real cognitive dissonance. So we built it into our culture values, and we've built it into our processes. So in our monthly one-on-ones, we talk about how you're doing this. In our performance review, we have a category all about it. What are you doing? And how are you prioritizing this? And then when we recognize and we do recognition, we reward people for that. And we do have recognition programs around that to just make sure that we're reinforcing the importance and the priority of that in our day-to-day.
Yeah, I think that's you brought up a great point about how it's important to live into the values. And so I'm coming at it from a different perspective because I'm an external consultant and coach who works on leadership development. And often there is that resistance of, well, we just don't have time. We're overloaded. Let's focus on just, achieving our goals. And then maybe when we have some time, because it's on the nice to have list, and people don't necessarily see it as a need to have. And yet, so when I go in, there's often a conversation of what's the cost of not doing it. And that discussion often never takes place because it's so go, 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 go. But when you can slow down and have that discussion and start identifying some of the costs, the balance shifts of it being put from nice to have to actually need to have. And as you mentioned too, Sarah-Jane, the idea of it being part of the values is really important because I think that was brought up in one of the presentations, I think it was in Rob's, about the integrity piece. All these companies have values, but only about 11% activate their values and live into them. And so it's that walking the talk. And if you can tie the values to the behavior and to the development, that becomes a lot of the times the organization's superpower, and they begin to excel.
I just want to quickly add, taking off from what Karen, Sarah Jane, and Tanya mentioned, that it's not as much as an excuse, because we're seeing people opting out of training quite often, considering the situation where we are in. As soon as I finish this call, I'm going to go check on my children if they're doing fine, instead of doing a micro learning following this, right? So the priorities have shifted a little bit. And then the organizations or teams like mine, when I head L&D, it's a responsibility that I need to assume and then talk about something like 70-20-10 model. Try and integrate that learning as a part of job. So 70% on the job project experience, 20% as part of mentoring, and then 10% on formal development, which now needs to be a little more slowed down, move to a virtual medium, and try and smaller breaks. Additionally, senior leadership, very senior and executive leaders, need to share their examples on what they're learning and how they're learning it, providing opportunities for mentorship. As I mentioned in the 70-20-10 model, it's very important at any stage. So the new leaders or new managers need this, middle managers need this, and so do the senior managers. So even if it's reverse mentoring, internal, external, coaching is a great example that Eric spoke about. Embedding learning as a part of the culture, which Sarah Jen mentioned, is very crucial. Do we talk about learning as a part of progress and growth in the organization, and then expect that ongoing development is expected part of your role? If you do not grow, then there's no responsibility. How will you assume higher responsibility? Show them that trade-off. What's the potential payoff if you didn't actually go for it? And schedule regular development meetings as a part of one-on-one conversations. Managers, folks like people who are on the call right now, need to have this development conversation on a regular basis, suggested at least once in a quarter. Co-create a development plan with your folks, and then participate actively. What we do regularly is, if a person from my team has gone for a training, I receive an email that says, how can you have a conversation participation? So they tell me what topics this person is learning and what kind of questions can I ask, so they know that I'm actively engaged in their growth and development. And then talk about career development as regularly as you can.
You touched on so many beautiful things in there. And one of the things that we've done that I found to be so successful is when you touched on the formal and the informal learning, but embedding that in the one-on-one conversations. And so we use like some kind of, they're structured templates, but with giving managers the ability to flex. But one of the things that we tell managers you don't flex on, and you make sure you include on at least a monthly basis, is that what are the goals that we're trying to achieve as a business? Where is your goal in relation to that goal? And then what are the formal learning that you're doing to support that goal so that you can be a stronger contributor as a team member? And maybe that's read a book, maybe that's take a course, maybe that's whatever it is, but what is the formal component where you can level up? And then what is the application or the informal component in how are you using that in the goal that you're working on? And so it makes for some really great conversations where it's not just about I'm learning these things and here's what I'm learning, and it's the application of the learning, and but how is this learning now driving the business outcomes, which ultimately is what the executive team want to see and hear. And when we can paint that picture through a model like an OKR or KPI type model, all the way up to, and this is what we did as a business, there's your buy-in and there's your additional support to prioritize it and talk about it, which is exciting.
I wanted to add to that. I love what was said, both by Sarah Jane and Andrew. There's a lot of that conversation. And for me, it's in the relationship-based leadership is where I come from. And it's one thing to have these goals and check, I've done my development, check, I've developed the skills. But what doesn't come often through, and that's often where people fall down, is that they don't have those conversations, both to have the support, but also to talk about the areas where they're having trouble stretching. And that's okay to have a problem where it's not coming easy. And maybe they need to ask for help from their coworkers, their managers, their direct reports to help them develop those skills that will help them jump to the next leadership level.
Amazing. Okay, I'm gonna move us on to question number 2. And again, please, if you have questions in the audience, feel free to drop them in the chat or the Q&A. I want to talk about skills next. how we determine skills. I talked a little bit about this in the presentation, talk about this a lot in my day-to-day. How do you think about the right set of skills for your leaders for 2021, for now and beyond in the future? And I'm going to start with Karen on this one and then open it up after that.
Hi. Yeah, it's funny because I was actually holding back from that last conversation because I knew a lot of what I was going to say was going to add on to all the great points that were just made. So I think at Order Groove, so we're a smaller company. So time is always the excuse for development conversations and why they're not happening or why I'm not investing in myself. And I think the three things that we as HR leaders or people and culture leaders or L&D leaders or however we classify ourselves have always known, but now I think people really understand the impact are communication, listening, empathy, and really carving out the time for those kinds of conversations to create a safe space for difficult conversations, to create a safe space to talk about stress or things that are going on at home or the unrest in the world. Do I still like my job? Is this still what I want to do? Where's my career path going? How can I take the steps to get there? Maybe your business completely changed over the last year. So I think the number one skill that we're focused on for our leadership team and our management team is how can you have those successful conversations. And by the way, maybe that's not part of your one-on-one. If your one-on-one truly is only half an hour and scheduling says you can only do half an hour, schedule an additional time. Maybe it's to kick off the week on a Monday, or maybe it's to wrap up the week on a Friday, but actually carving in the time to have that human relationship and that human connection to talk about all those key things. And then all the skills that enable managers to have that conversation again, empathy, listening, communication. So they're skills that we've always known were important, but I think the world finally demonstrated why they're so important. And so as we go into 2021, that's really where we are leaning in. And by the way, how to do all of that remotely. So it's very different to sit across the table from someone and maybe have some of those conversations. How do you do it looking in a camera? How do you do it when maybe kids are running around on the side or 4 roommates are sitting just on the other side of the room? How to have those conversations virtually. So those are the different things that we're really focused on.
I love what you said, Karen, about the relationship. That's been the focus. And, it's kind of the way that I see it is there are actually no difficult conversations. There may be conversations that are uncomfortable. And what people tend to describe as difficult is often they don't have the skill sets to have them and to deal with the emotions that make them uncomfortable. And as we can develop people's skill sets around having those kinds of conversations that maybe feel foreign or that they're not skilled at having, or that might bring up emotions in themselves that they are uncomfortable with, right? Or it's not so clear and step by step, the better that we can then develop people, right? And so to me, that's the biggest focus. And also by modeling it, developing them in the leaders, it models that so that other people can learn by experiencing and by viewing, both on both ends, and then can start to practice. And there can be a conversation about those skills. What was it like to be on the receiving end? What was it like when I messed up? You can start to have conversations like that. So I love that that's coming into the discourse right now.
Oh, wow. That was such an impactful. And Tanya, for your role being that external coach, that's where we've really benefited from leveraging external coaches to just come in and create psychological safety in smaller groups to do that practice. We have such an incredibly diverse population. And for those who aren't comfortable having those types of conversations, it's like when you're in elementary school or in high school in math class and your math teacher's like, you get 0 because you didn't show your work. They need to understand your thought process. And the only way to clarify how to work through is to walk through the thought process and show your work. And doing that in a challenging conversation through like Coach's Corner is what we've been doing with role play and building up the safety for even the most introverted individual to feel comfortable to participate in a role play, but then to do that role play and then talk through the role play and the successes. that has been such a valuable process.
Yeah, I love what you're saying about the coaching and the training. And my background is in both. I have the training background and the one-on-one coaching. And I think that there's a place for both. And sometimes working with small groups and establishing a common language even can then allow for some of those conversations to start taking place, where there becomes an exchange of information, and you can go into areas and it creates trust that then enables and uplifts the actual performance, because a lot of the blockages or the things that are left unsaid start to get dealt with. And then the same thing when a whole team is talking in the same language, the manager can then come in and manage the team from that perspective. And then the one-on-one coaching allows for each individual to develop the specific areas that they are having problems with or are weaker in.
It's why things like values or the different assessments that Eric was talking about in his last section are so helpful, because it creates that shared communication, that shared language. And I know so many people have heard this phrase before, but it's the trust bank theory, that if you start to have a couple of these conversations with your manager and it doesn't go well, you will immediately retreat and never try again, because you've withdrawn way too much from the trust bank. It takes way too long to make the deposits. So can't agree more that training the managers on these things is the only way to actually do it. And I love the point about the role modeling. Like, if you're able, especially in a world of vulnerability these days, if you're able to share your own stories, that goes a long way.
Yeah, I love that that we're talking so much about trust and psychological safety, as Sarah Jane mentioned, because I think that's so important. And to bring it back into the context of remote working, I think, what I've learned over this last year is just how intentional we have to be about cultivating that psychological safety in a remote environment, when you don't have the casual conversations asking, hey, how was your weekend? Or, talking about your kids or your last travel adventure. When you don't have those little moments to build that, trust and psychological safety in a sort of natural, organic way, we have to make sure that we're making space and time for those moments as well.
So we got a question from the audience that I'd like to ask. It's directed or added to Tanya. So I'll start, if you're okay with that. And the question is, as a consultant, how do you navigate when clients ask you for the ROI of your people upskilling programs? And just afterward, we answer this question internally as well. I think the consultant angle is going to be really interesting, but anybody else that wants to jump in on if folks ask for ROI of people upskilling programs and responses.
So I think one of the first things to look at is we all know, I think it was even mentioned, that one of the biggest reasons that people leave is a bad manager, right? Bad leaders, bad managers, out of integrity with the values, or a company talking one value and not doing the other. Uber, the example of Uber was perfect. And so there's first of all, even just looking at what is the cost of an employee leaving, going on disability or stress leave. What's the cost of, that's at the extreme, right? And then having to retrain somebody, because retraining somebody costs twice as much as maintaining an existing employee who may be underperforming. And then there's the cost of underperformance and team conflict. So just starting there as the starting point starts to broaden it between, well, do we invest in this person and show me the direct ROI, versus looking at the bigger picture, where a lot of the bleed out can happen through indirect mechanisms. And that's where you have to look at the bigger picture. I don't know if anybody else wants to add. Yeah.
I just wanted to touch on what Eric mentioned in his presentation about there's a big question of how do we continue measuring ROI for all of L&D. And then I hope, Eric, with the work that you're doing and researching and with your master's in analytics, I hope all of us will benefit from that, because what you can't measure cannot be done, right? So we do rely on old tried and tested methods of Kirkpatrick measurement to talk about reaction, learning, behavior, and results. But I believe that's a good measurement for learning teams. Like, business doesn't necessarily care for it as much. They do care for a result, but they want to speak the language that business talks. So what we do is we focus on changes on manager effectiveness surveys. So we partner with Culture Amp at Xrole. We partner with Culture Amp for various surveys. One of them is manager effectiveness survey, which we run annually. And we would like to see the movement in change for Xrole managers as well as compared to the industry, right? So that allows us to see what behavior changes are being seen. Additionally, inclusion survey. So any kind of survey that the business cares for is how we check the response from our programs and then try and relate those matrices with the engagement matrices of our employees as well. So I'd say not to create anything fancier. If this helps internally to the L&D team, go for it, but talk to business in their terms, and that's when they care. Do talk about a little bit of pre and post assessments. Those are helpful engagement during the process of any training, especially if it's a long-term program. And then I guess we're going to talk about the effectiveness of some of these programs. But if it's very long-term program, then try and integrate various ways to do checkpoints, which could be quizzes, fun engagements, etc. But always keep in mind, if you're going to present these matrices to the business, do they really care for the language that you're talking? If you're saying, oh, on the Kirkpatrick method, on Elvin survey, this is the result, I'm not sure if they're going to buy that.
And for anyone who's at a smaller company like ourselves, like SurveyMonkey works. And if you don't have these big fancy programs that I know we all would always love to have, even just in your culture pulse surveys, my manager's committed to my development, or I feel like I have the support of my development, or any of those kinds of questions as part of your already engagement surveys can also help with some of these milestones and some of the ROI that we've been talking about.
Okay. I'm going to go to a COVID question. I don't know if there's been a panel discussion in the last year that hasn't had some kind of COVID question. I'm curious how COVID, it could be the move to fully remote work for a while, or just disruption to different office environments or processes, how that's changed, how it changed your leadership development in the last 12 to 15 months, and then perhaps what might become permanent from that change. Carla, I'll tee you up to start here and then open it up after that.
Yeah, I think what I mentioned earlier about just the awareness of needing to be more intentional with our actions is one thing that I think has just really come to surface. I think the other thing that has been really interesting and eye-opening is the advantages that come from us all being remote. Prior to this, you may have had leaders who were in a remote situation, but they were the exception, that the bulk of the team members were located in the headquarters or whatnot. And so, developing that empathy and understanding of what it's like to be remote is a major win, I think. And just, I hope we can all hold on to that empathy and carry it forward, even if we do move back towards an in-office situation. Again, depends on what the business is planning to do. But I think also learning that it's possible to do these types of training remotely as well. That, prior to this, I personally would have thought, oh, it's going to be really hard to do like the breakout groups and, having those aspects in the actual training itself would have felt really difficult. And now that we've tried it and it works, and yeah, there's some aspects of it that are not perfect, and we'd like to sort of polish those things up and make them even better. The fact that we've seen it actually work makes it just, primes us to do that tweaking and do those technology improvements that can make it even better, knowing that at least we've got a foundational basis to start from.
I think one of the other things that's been interesting is trying to be intentional about like the social component. As human beings, when we see somebody doing something, we tend to follow the crowd. And so when you're in the office and you see another person stop by and say, "Are you okay?" Even if you didn't intuitively sense there was something wrong, you're like, oh, something's wrong. Maybe I should check in on that person too. I'm a good friend, or whatever it is. And you need those social cues when you're not naturally intuitive into some of those social contexts. And so bringing a remote social cue into it is also really helpful. And this is where, I feel like this combined with like nudges and communication are just really fantastic skills. Hey, thank you everybody for the 85% of the people who did this one-on-one this month and who provided some feedback. That's really important. Here's why, here's how we're using this, and just really doubling down on helping everybody understand that this is really important and why, and calling out, reinforcing the positive behaviors so that when those who aren't doing them, they're like, whoa, why am I the only one not doing this? And maybe I should start, but I don't know how. Provide the resources, all those things. That social component, nudges, the consistent reminders with a really strong communication strategy of why this is important, what this means, what's in it for me, here's how you do it. And just keeping that in mind in this remote environment just help us all stay in tune with each other.
I'd love to add something about the social cues. Two very quick things. One is because we're so busy and it's so easy to lose track of days and time and everything, a social cue you might be getting now is if you haven't seen someone on Slack as much, or if you haven't seen someone turn on their video who used to, right? Like some people can't, and that's totally okay. But what's changing in their connection, that might be actually a cue that something might be going on with them that, you can't see it in the kitchen, like Sarah Jane mentioned, but, that's maybe a cue that you can be looking for. The other thing I'll also throw out is going back to the why and like helping people stay engaged and do some of those things. One thing that we learned a lot too is online versus offline. And so we're all tech company employees, like we don't have manufacturing or anything to think about that. So we always just kind of went to the online option. But people, again, who had kids or other things that were going on, the last thing they could do was do one more survey or one more Zoom call or one more whatever. So if it was something that we really needed out of them, we gave them a couple of different ways to complete the sort of quote unquote assignment, so that whatever was going on in their life or whatever things they were trying to balance, it gave them a couple of different ways to be part of whatever the thing was. So just a couple of quick suggestions.
I love what you said, Karen, about the whole, like the different people and what everybody's raised about kind of the intentionality. And that to me is the biggest piece of the learning from COVID, is now that there's been this blurring between work and home, and we've seen people in their home environments that they can't always just disassociate and present their work personality to. We've started to have to realize that it's not necessarily even desirable to have this segregation between home and work. And that when we can start to relating people as entire people in their entirety versus just one aspect of them, that we can then have better communication, better understanding of where they're at, better understanding of their needs and how to develop them, and the context that they're operating in. And to me, that's a big shift that's happening in this conversation, is looking at the whole person and being in relationship with the whole person versus just an aspect of them.
Okay, I'm gonna just take off from what the wonderful things other panelists have said and add on to that 70 aspect that I mentioned in 70, 20, 10, actually 70 on the job. Now it's actually happening in my house, in your house, and just trying to figure that. So, when you look at it, the entirety, because I'm not at work, those conversations are not happening organically after a training program has happened. So in the leadership development strategy, the biggest change I'd say we're trying to now do is learning pods. So after a training program has happened, we try and sort of create accountability buddies. So this group, let's say, come together every Tuesday without a facilitator, and then we discuss that in a certain program, we learned these strategies, what's worked for you, what's worked for me. And if I'm having some hurdles, could you share some of your best practices so that we can all together learn and continue doing that? So that's number one. Number two is peer-to-peer circles. Now, let's say if this is around a performance management time and there is a time when you have to provide feedback and I, as a new manager, struggle, then this pod again comes together and then we share, how do you suggest that I approach this conversation? How do we help? So we help them organically do these best practice sessions, the peer-to-peer manager sessions, and have these conversations. So this is not necessarily an formal training, but part of the informal, but it continues building over a period of time when you know that there's a safe space for you to have these conversations and then learn from each other. So that's one. And then focus on micro learning. That has been really helpful. As I mentioned previously, we do partner with Culture Amp, another plugin, but we do appreciate the support that they have. And another company called Life Labs, they've co-created content of micro learning. So when you can integrate something in a flow of work, because skill coach portion of that, actually you can integrate with Slack, and every morning, the time that I said, 8 a.m., I get that pop-up, and it's just 2 or 3 minutes of learning. So easy for me. And then if I decline that day, it's going to start another day. So use technology as much as possible. And then for your reliance, don't overwhelm and try and think on what's important for now.